Hi there and welcome back. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet. Not into battle, not into noise, not even into the heart of a royal court, but into the fields of a small village, far from the cities, where the sky presses low and the rivers move slowly, and where a girl once walked with bare feet through grass that held the dew like secrets. This is a story that begins softly, and it stays soft, even as it moves toward fire. We begin in Domremy, a village so small you could hear a door close from the other side of it. The air there in the early 1400s would have smelled like clay and river moss, like thatched roofs after rain and wood smoke from a cooking fire where nothing fancy simmered, only onions and broth and prayers spoken under breath. Most people didn't read. Most people didn't leave. The year moved in circles, lambing, sowing, mending, fasting, and no one expected a 13-year-old girl to be the one to break that circle wide open. Her name was Jean, but later they would call her the Maid. Still later, they would call her a saint, and long before all of that, she was just a quiet daughter in a quiet home. One with her sleeves rolled up and her thoughts turned inward, always listening for something most people couldn't hear. There are things the history books keep about her, battles, letters, trials, but there are more things they don't, like the sound her shoes made on packed dirt, or how she probably tucked her hair behind her ear when she thought too long, or how the smell of sheep and clean air followed her wherever she went. She grew up in a time of ruin, war tearing across France like a slow, dry fire. But her childhood was small and slow, and that's where we begin. She was not born into a world that listened to girls, or saints, or visions. But she listened anyway. And one afternoon when the sun hung high over the hills and the bees moved through the orchard like drifting sparks, the voice came, not like thunder, not like music, just present, clear, gentle, a name spoken in stillness. And Jean listened, that's all. That's how it started. No sword, no armor, just a girl standing still in a field, heart quiet, eyes open, waiting. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Garden Wall. Let's begin with the quiet things. Not the voices, not yet. Not the soldiers or the saints or the fire. Just the things that came first. The slower, ordinary hours of a childhood spent beneath the weight of sky, in a village wrapped in earth and habit, where the stones in the walls stayed warm long after sunset, and the garden gate creaked only when someone came home. Domremy was the kind of place that didn't draw maps so much as memory. One winding lane, 24 homes, a small chapel with a steeple that leaned just slightly in the wind, and the sound of cows lowing in the misted distance. The land was soft and green in the spring, muddy and stubborn in winter, and always marked by the river Meuse, which cut across the edge of the village like a line drawn gently with a fingertip. People rose early, spoke quietly, and moved through life as their parents had before them. And in the middle of it all was a girl named Jean. Her father, Jacques, was a tenant farmer, not poor in the way stories like to say, but not wealthy either. He worked with what the land allowed, and the land in turn offered just enough. Her mother, Isabelle, kept the home. She baked bread with careful hands, mended wool when the light was strong, and taught Jean the prayers that reached heaven with more hope than certainty. The family lived in a cottage with a slate roof and a small stone hearth that burned with peat and pine, depending on the season. Chickens scratched at the yard. A few goats wandered. Nothing remarkable, nothing loud, just life. Jean was the fourth child, not the eldest and not the youngest. just in between enough to go half noticed on busy days and fully depended on during quieter ones. She had strong hands for her age and a voice that didn't rise much above a murmur, even when she laughed. People liked her well enough. She was polite, helpful. She could knead dough and fetch water and speak her Latin prayers without stumbling. But even then, even in those early years, there was something else, something quieter, something inward-leaning about her. She liked the places just beyond where she was supposed to go. The garden wall, the edge of the orchard, the trail that led uphill to the pasture. She didn't wander far, not really, but she lingered. She listened to birdsong, to wind, to silence. She had the kind of presence that made you think she was paying attention even when you didn't say a word. And often she was. When the chores were done, she sat in the small shade beneath the fig tree, hands in her lap, feet tucked neatly beneath her skirt, and eyes half closed. Not from sleep, but from something else. Stillness. Absorption. She didn't fidget or shift like the other children. She stayed still, like a stone warmed by the sun. And if you asked her what she was thinking about, she might look at you for a moment, not puzzled, just patient, before answering softly, "Nothing, just listening." And she meant it. She listened to the bees in the lavender, to the distant hum of the river, to the creak of her father's wheelbarrow and the click of her mother's shears. She listened in a way that made time slow down, as if the world wasn't passing but pausing beside her, as if the things people called noise were just other kinds of language she hadn't yet learned to speak. She wasn't considered strange, just good. That's the word people used later when they looked back. Good. A good girl. A helpful girl. Church every Sunday. Bread delivered to neighbors. A child with clean hands and kind eyes. She wasn't marked, at least not visibly. And yet, when asked, some villagers would say, gently, as if not to offend, that there had always been something about her. She spent more time near the chapel than most girls her age. Not inside, necessarily. Not always. Sometimes she just stood near it, fingers trailing along the stone as if feeling for something beyond shape. She liked to sit near the garden wall, where the light fell warm in the late afternoon, and the bells could still be heard from across the hill. And when she prayed, it was not with urgency, but with familiarity, as though she wasn't speaking to heaven, but with it. She never claimed to see anything, not yet. She never spoke of saints, not then. But even in those early years, she believed there was more to this world than the dirt under her feet and the steam from the soup pot. She believed, quietly, fully, that God was listening, and so she listened too. Not for miracles, not for angels, just for presence. And maybe that's where her story truly begins. Not on the battlefield, not in the courtroom, but there, beside a garden wall, with her hands resting gently on her lap and the wind tugging lightly at her veil. A girl sitting still in the middle of the century's noise, doing what no one else thought to do. Listening. Chapter 2. The voices begin. It didn't begin with thunder. There was no flash of lightning across the hills, no split sky or trembling ground, no shouts from above or dramatic parting of clouds. In fact, it began on a summer day so quiet, so ordinary, that even the birds seemed to be resting. The fields shimmered in soft heat, and the shadows of the orchard trees stretched long and slow across the grass like sleeping arms. Jean was 13, barefoot, and likely carrying something in her apron, maybe herbs or apples or a bit of mending to take to her mother. She was not looking for a revelation. She was not asking for a sign. But it came anyway. She would later say it was at midday, around noon, when the sun was at its most honest. Not hidden, not low, not distant, but right above her, flooding the world in warm, pale light. She stood near her father's garden, or perhaps along the edge of the pasture, where the road forked and wildflowers grew in the cracks between the stones. It's hard to say exactly where, because Jean herself never seemed too concerned with the setting. What mattered, what lingered across every retelling, was the moment itself. A voice, clear, kind, neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft, simply present. And in that moment, the world didn't fall away. It stayed where it was, sun-drenched, familiar, steady, but something within it opened. As if a layer had been pulled back and something older, gentler, wiser had stepped just close enough to be heard, not shouted, not imagined, but heard. The voice called her by name. That was all it took. Later, there would be questions. From judges, from priests, from kings and scribes and soldiers and skeptics. They would ask her to explain it, where the voice came from, what it sounded like, why she believed it. And she, always calm, always steady, would answer as best she could, that it was the voice of Saint Michael, or Saint Catherine, or Saint Margaret, or perhaps all three, that it brought her peace, not fear, that it didn't demand, but guided, that it came not once, but again and again, each time arriving like the soft ringing of a chapel bell heard through a veil of leaves. But in the beginning, it was just that first moment. One voice, one name. It didn't tell her to lead armies. It didn't say France. It didn't speak of crowns or swords or coronations. It simply arrived. And she, with the same quiet certainty she used to pull weeds from the garden or kneel on the chapel floor, believed it. She didn't tell anyone. Not right away. Because even at 13, Jean knew the weight of strange things. She knew that certain truths were too soft to be handled by others, that even a kind voice could be twisted into fear by the wrong ears. So she kept it close, not as a secret, exactly, but as something sacred, folded carefully into her daily life like a pressed flower in the pages of a prayer book. She continued to help her mother. She continued to attend Mass. She stitched. She swept. She knelt beside her bed each night with her hands clasped and her breath steady. But something had changed. The way she moved through the world carried new stillness, deeper attention, a sort of listening that went beyond the ears. When she looked up at the clouds, she seemed to be studying something just beyond them. When she stood alone in the orchard, her eyes didn't wander, they waited. And as the weeks turned into months, the voice came again, and again, and again. Sometimes it spoke comfort, sometimes encouragement, sometimes gently it gave instruction. Nothing radical at first, nothing frightening. Pray more often, be kind to your neighbors, obey your parents, keep yourself pure. But the messages began to grow, not louder but wider, as if the voice was slowly laying out a path before her, brick by brick, light by light. And then one day, it told her what she was meant to do. That France, her country, torn and frayed by war and betrayal, needed her. That she was to go to the king, or rather the Dauphin, Charles, and help him reclaim his crown. That she, a girl with no sword, no education, no noble blood, and no power, would be the one to lift the siege at Orlleon and turn the tide of a war that had been burning for nearly 100 years. It would have sounded impossible, unthinkable, absurd, except it didn't. Because Jean had been listening for a long time, not just to voices from heaven, but to the world around her, the stories shared by her neighbors, the despair in her father's voice when he spoke of taxes and battles, the weeping of women whose sons had died in a war they didn't start. She had seen what was broken, and now she was being told to mend it. She hesitated, not out of fear, at least not entirely, but because the instruction was so large and she was still so small. But the voice didn't shout, it didn't rush, it waited with her. And in time, she began to believe that her stillness, her patience, her quiet listening had been preparing her for something all along. She still kept it to herself for a while longer. She continued to serve, to pray, to live as she always had. But now inside her was a soft, growing fire. Not one that consumed, but one that warmed and revealed. The voice would not go away, and Jean had no reason to ask it to. Chapter 3: A mission unfolds. When a calling arrives quietly, it doesn't always demand swift movement. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it deepens, and sometimes it settles like water in the grooves of your daily life until the shape of your path is no longer what it used to be. Until one morning, you wake and find that staying still has become harder than going forward. For Jean, the quiet girl from Domremy, that moment did not come with shouts or banners. It came slowly, through the long turning of seasons, as her sense of purpose grew alongside her sense of sorrow. Sorrow for France, which bled quietly through its fields and cities like a wound no one knew how to close. The 100 Years' War, as it would later be called, was not a single event, not a grand and sweeping war of heroes and villains, but a grinding series of conflicts, battles over land, power, inheritance. And the people who suffered were not nobles in towers, but the ones who tilled the soil and buried their sons behind cottages made of mud and timber. France had been split, humiliated, and tired for longer than John had been alive. The English had taken much, and Burgundy, once a French ally, had betrayed the crown. The Dauphin, the rightful heir Charles, had not been crowned, and many had begun to lose hope that he ever would be. But John had not lost hope. Not because she was stubborn, though she was, and not because she had reason to believe in royalty, she had none, but because she believed in something deeper than kings. She believed in the voice. By the time she was 16, it was no longer just a whisper in the garden or a comfort in prayer. It had become clear, firm. It told her to go. Not someday, not eventually, now. She was to go to a town called Vaucouleurs, a place not terribly far from home, but far enough to matter, and ask for an escort to take her to the court of the Dauphin himself. She was to leave her village, leave her family, and take with her only what she needed: her faith, her courage, and her absolute certainty that this mission did not belong to her, but to God. She told her family. Her father did not understand. Her mother was frightened. Her neighbors murmured. Some laughed. Some whispered that she had lost her senses. But Jean stood calmly in the doorway of their cottage and told them that she would go, whether they permitted her or not. It was not rebellion. It was resolve. And so she went. Not on horseback, not in armor, but on foot, in plain clothing, with the wind in her face and her purpose tucked like a letter into her chest. She walked to Vaucouleurs. She asked to see the commander there, Robert de Baudricourt, a man known for loyalty to the Dauphin and for little else. When she first spoke to him, he dismissed her outright. She was a girl, after all, young, small, and without name. He did not hear the fire beneath her softness. He sent her home. But she returned. Weeks passed, maybe months. She worked, waited, listened again. And when the voice urged her once more, She returned to Baudricourt's court, this time with the support of a few who had begun to believe, a few who had watched her speak with confidence beyond her years, and who had not seen madness, but clarity. Baudricourt listened. More than that, he watched, and though it likely went against his every instinct, he agreed. He gave her a small escort. He gave her men, horses, and a borrowed tunic. And so Jean dressed like a soldier, not for disguise, but for safety, and began the long, uncertain journey toward the court of the uncrowned king. She rode through winter roads and bitter cold, through frost-bitten forests and towns still smoking from war. She prayed in silence. She shared her bread. And though the men who rode with her were wary at first, they watched her. And something in her steadiness, her lack of complaint, her unshakable calm, began to change them. There is no record of her growing afraid. Not on the road, not in the dark, not when they passed enemy territory. Not even when she stood in the halls of Chinon, the grand, echoing fortress where the Dauphin kept his court, surrounded by doubt and fading loyalty. They say he tried to trick her, that he stood in the crowd dressed plainly, hiding among his advisors, while another man in finery took his place on the throne. And Jean, this girl of the countryside, this daughter of no one, this peasant in borrowed armor, walked through the crowded room with steady steps and went straight to the real king. She knelt and she said, "I am sent." She didn't ask for gold. She didn't demand command. She didn't speak like someone with ambition. She spoke like someone with a task to complete, as if history itself had tapped her on the shoulder and asked gently if she might help set it straight. And Charles, unsure, surrounded by doubts, desperate for hope, listened. Because in a world ruled by bloodlines, wealth, and swords, here was someone who claimed only one thing: not power, not glory, but belief. And that belief, when spoken in her voice, calm, unwavering, and warm, felt like something worth following. Chapter 4. The Journey to the King. The road to Chinon wasn't marked by milestones or maps or even certainty. It stretched in winding curves across a cold, war-torn country where loyalties changed with the wind and safety was a word more imagined than found. The journey itself, from Vaucouleurs to the court of the Dauphin, was just over 300 miles as the crow flies. But Jean didn't fly. She rode, and every mile pressed like weight into her limbs, into her thoughts, into the stillness she carried like a second skin. She was 17 now, or nearly, and still wore her mission like a garment no one else could see. The voices had not gone quiet. They came to her with regularity and warmth, sometimes with instruction, sometimes with reassurance, and sometimes simply as presence, a reminder that she was not walking alone, even if no one beside her could hear what she heard. She did not dress like a girl. She could not. The journey was dangerous, through forests stalked by soldiers and hills scattered with thieves. The war had torn up not only fields and cities, but the quiet rules of travel. And so Jean bound her chest, tied her hair beneath a coif, and wore the clothing of a young squire. Sturdy wool tunic, thick leggings, leather boots. It was not a disguise. It was a shield. The men who rode with her were older. Most had fought in the war or served in the houses of lesser nobles, or seen the backs of villages burning after a siege. They were not poets or mystics. They were men of the ground, practical, blunt, and tired. At first, they regarded Jean with a kind of gentle suspicion. She was quiet, certainly, and serious. But they had seen seriousness before, and it often led to madness. What made her different wasn't how she spoke, it was how she listened. She didn't command, she didn't rebuke, she didn't try to convert or convince. She simply moved among them like a candle in a dark hall, steady, unshaking, and quietly useful. She rode long hours without complaint, she prayed at dusk without flourish, she shared what food she had and asked for little. And slowly the suspicion shifted. Not into awe, not yet, but into something softer, respect. The journey took nearly 2 weeks. They passed through forests choked with bramble and rivers swollen from winter melt. They slept in barns when they could, beneath trees when they couldn't, and took care to avoid known battle roads. Jean never showed fear, not when wolves howled nearby, not when the fog settled in thick and cold, not even when a band of soldiers passed close enough to smell the smoke from their cloaks. She carried her silence like armor, not heavy, but whole. Some nights, when the fire burned low and the others drifted off into a cold, dreamless sleep, Jean would sit up beneath the stars and write invisible words into her memory. Not letters to others, but to herself, to the God who had called her, to the voices who still came, to the France she had not yet seen whole, but already loved like a child loves the face of a mother they can only remember in glimpses. And when they reached Chinon, the city came into view not like a destination, but like the next page of a book she had already been writing in her mind for years. The court was not as regal as one might expect. Charles, the Dauphin, was not yet king. His realm was shrinking, his power diluted, his court more cautious than grand. He had not been crowned. He was surrounded by divided council, uncertain allies, and the heavy doubt that comes when faith begins to starve. Jean, in her plain attire and quiet eyes, arrived at a court used to people who wanted something. She didn't seem to want anything. Not gold, not fame, not comfort, only an audience. At first, they refused. The guards were skeptical. The advisors were amused. A girl? From the countryside? Who claimed to be sent by God? But Jean stood her ground, not with loud demands, but with unwavering calm. She waited. She prayed. She told them again and again that she had come not for herself, but for France. That God had given her a message. That the Dauphin would be king, but only if he listened. Word reached Charles. He was curious. Not convinced, but curious. And so he devised a test. He stood among his court in plain clothing, while another man, richly dressed, took his place on the throne. The trick had been used before. True prophets, it was said, could see through illusion. Jean entered the room with steady steps, her armor not yet metal, but belief. She looked once at the man on the throne and walked right past him. Then, without pause, she turned and knelt before Charles, still dressed as an ordinary noble. She did not waver. She did not blink. She simply said, "I am Jean, and I am sent." Charles listened, not because he was sure, but because in her eyes, in her voice, in the grounded clarity of her presence, there was something that did not match anything he had seen in months, or perhaps in his entire life. Something that was not ambition, not desperation, not flattery. It was belief. And in a court full of men who feared losing what little they had, Jean, with nothing to her name but certainty, felt like hope. Chapter 5. The Armor and the Banner. She never asked for a sword. Not at first. What Jean wanted, what she spoke of in her still, measured voice, was not the thrill of war, not victory for its own sake, and certainly not the sheen of metals or the clang of iron. What she asked for, humbly and without hesitation, was to be allowed to ride, to go where the danger was, to be near the place her voices had told her she was needed. She didn't want glory. She wanted Orleans. By the time Charles agreed to give her a command, if it could be called that, the court was already shifting. Some laughed, some warned, a few believed, but most watched, because Jeanne had already passed the first and most difficult test. She had not folded, not under doubt, not under delay, not under scrutiny. Now the question became simpler, though no less strange. If she was going to ride, what would she wear? A dress was unthinkable. Armor was unlikely. And yet, the more time passed, the clearer it became that if she was to be taken seriously, not just by the nobles, but by the soldiers she hoped to ride alongside, she would need more than faith. She would need steel. And so the tailors were summoned. The smiths were called, and piece by piece, a suit of armor was made for a girl who had never lifted a sword, but whose presence had already begun to move the hearts of grown men. It was not gilded, it was not ornate, it was simple, polished silver plate, fitted to her small frame, designed for movement, not show. She wore it over chainmail, over wool, over skin that had known nothing but work and prayer and cold. When she walked in it for the first time, the light caught it gently, not in brilliance, but in softness, as if the metal had agreed to shine only as much as she needed. She wore it without complaint, without posing, without ceremony. And alongside the armor came something else. Something she asked for with far more clarity than weapons. A banner. She didn't want it as a symbol of rank or dominion. She wanted it to carry the image she had seen in her visions, a field of white, pure and simple, upon which was painted an image of Christ in glory, holding the world, flanked by angels. On the staff were the names Jesus Maria. That was it. No crest, no crown. Just faith, made visible. She carried it more often than she carried a sword. The men began to gather. Some were skeptical, others were merely curious. But more and more of them came, archers, foot soldiers, horsemen, captains, drawn not by orders but by word. The word was that there was a girl who had heard God, and that she did not flinch, she did not boast, she did not hesitate, she simply stood. And when she spoke of France, it was not as a general speaks of territory, it was as a daughter speaks of her mother. She trained, she learned quickly, she practiced riding in armor, lifting her banner high above the crowd, moving with purpose and grace through the camps. She ate little, slept rarely, prayed often, but even when weary, she remained focused, not stern, but attentive, like someone listening always for instructions whispered between the silence. And then came the sword. It wasn't forged for her. It wasn't newly made. In fact, according to Jeanne, she hadn't chosen it at all. She had received a vision, another whisper in the stillness, of a sword buried behind the altar in a chapel near Fierbois, where she had stopped during her journey to Chinon. She described the chapel, the location, the spot where it lay. And when the soldiers went to look, they found it, just as she said, rusted but whole, waiting. 5 crosses etched into the blade. That was the sword she carried. Not jeweled, not royal, just found. And when she wore it at her waist, she did so without spectacle. She did not swing it about. She did not shout commands. She carried it as one might carry a torch, not to attack but to see. Word spread, not just among soldiers but among the people. In taverns, in churches, in the fields between towns, people began to whisper of the girl in white armor, the girl who spoke softly and rode hard, the girl with the banner who prayed before battle and kissed the earth before sleep. She was not noble, she was not trained, but she was something else entirely, and that something could not be ignored. Before she left for Orleans, Jean was examined by theologians, priests, bishops, learned men who sat in judgment, not out of cruelty but caution. They asked questions about her voices, her visions, her beliefs. They looked for signs of heresy, madness, pride, and what they found, again and again, was not arrogance or delusion, but simplicity, certainty, reverence. They approved her. And so when the day finally came, when the horses were saddled and the supplies were packed and the city of Orleans lay heavy with siege, Jean mounted her horse, not at the front, not flanked by trumpets or fanfare, but as part of a column, just one among many, her banner rising above her like a prayer stitched in white. She did not ride like a warrior. She rode like someone returning to where they already knew they were needed. Her eyes were not fierce, but focused. Her hands did not shake, and those who rode beside her felt something shift. Not the sky, not the wind, but the thing behind the sky, the thing behind the wind. The presence of belief so strong, so grounded, that even the most skeptical among them found themselves, without meaning to, sitting up straighter in the saddle. Orleans was waiting, and so was Jean. Chapter 6. The Siege of Orleans. The city had been surrounded for months, not by silence, but by waiting. Orleans, hemmed in like a breath held too long, sat under the slow weight of English force. Earthworks, towers, trenches, and soldiers who built their victory not with speed, but with patience, piling stone on strategy, fire on distance, fear on starvation. It was April when Jean arrived, but the siege had begun long before the first snows of winter, and within the walls, hope had been thinning like smoke. The people were tired, not in the dramatic sense, not as martyrs or heroes or poets, but in the slow, daily way that people get tired when meals shrink, when roofs leak, when fear comes not in thunderclaps, but in the low groan of another day, exactly like the one before it. The English had ringed the city with forts and wooden walls. Supplies could barely pass through. Messages came by night, and prayers rose in every language that desperation knows. And then word came of a girl. Not a general, not a noble, not even a soldier. A girl, riding under a white banner, with saints in her voice and a sword found behind an altar. At first, it didn't matter. People had heard stranger things. And yet, when she finally appeared, not as a story, but as a figure on horseback, armor catching the morning sun, eyes wide and steady beneath a cropped fringe of brown hair, something in the stillness of the streets began to shift. She entered the city by way of the southern gate, across a bridge that trembled with watching. The people came to see her, not because they believed in her, but because they needed something to believe in. She dismounted without ceremony. She didn't wave. She didn't shout. She simply looked around, nodded once, and said the words she had been saying for months now, "I am sent." She walked among the wounded. Not quickly, not for show, but slowly. A hand placed on a shoulder here, a prayer whispered into a broken rhythm there, her banner held not high but respectfully upright. She stopped at the churches. She knelt before the altar. She listened to the weeping. And then, when she stood again, she called the commanders together. Men decades older, twice her size, and schooled in the logic of war. And she told them what they must do. They must lift the siege. They must fight. Some resisted, politely. Others laughed, not cruelly, but helplessly. She was 17. She didn't know the terrain. She didn't understand tactics. But when she looked at them, not with defiance, but with unflinching calm, something in their logic softened. Perhaps because they had no better plan. Perhaps because she seemed to know something they didn't. Perhaps because she listened first and spoke only after. She did not lead from behind. In the days that followed, she mounted her horse with the rest of them, not in polished rows, but in scattered, aching formations. She watched the sun rise from behind ramparts that groaned under the weight of snow and ash. And when the call to charge came, she rode near the front, banner lifted high above the heads of those who carried real weapons, who had tasted real blood. She rode not like a knight, but like someone trying to reach something just out of sight. Not death, not glory, but purpose. The first skirmishes were small. Supply lines, guard posts, the outer fingers of the siege. And yet in every charge, Jean was there. Not swinging, but standing, shouting encouragement, raising her banner toward heaven, like a thread pulled taut between this world and the next. She did not command armies, she moved hearts. When an arrow struck her shoulder, clean through, blood warm against the edge of her armor, she cried out, but she did not leave. They begged her to retreat. She refused. She did not call it bravery, she called it obedience. The voices had told her what to do, and pain was not a reason to stop. In time, the tide began to turn. One fortress fell, then another. The English line, once tight and ruthless, began to fray. The soldiers of Orlleon, once resigned to another slow defeat, began to shout her name as they ran, not out of worship, but out of momentum. Because she was there, always there, a white flame in the middle of chaos, a girl whose presence made it harder to give up. And then, after months of siege, of suffering, of circling despair, the English withdrew, quietly, one camp at a time. Their fortresses burned, their dead buried, their generals baffled. They called it madness, or trickery, or divine favor. They couldn't say for certain. But the siege was over, and Orlleon was free. She had done what she said she would do. And yet, she did not celebrate. Not loudly, not like the others. She prayed, she wrote, she wept a little, not for herself, but for the lives lost, for the wounded she could not save, for the weight of what came next. Because victory, as the voices had warned her, was not the end of the journey. It was only the gate. What she had done was not impossible, only improbable. What remained would be far harder. But for now, Orlleon was no longer waiting. And Jean, the quiet girl who once sat beside a garden wall listening for God, now stood in armor beneath a French sky, holding her banner in wind that smelled like smoke and spring. She had come, she had seen, and the world had started to believe. Chapter 7. The Coronation. There are moments in history that feel loud when you read them. Moments that look like triumphs, with trumpets and banners and crowns catching the light. But often inside those moments, when you step close enough to breathe the same air, they are much quieter. And the road to them is not paved with joy, but with dust, with waiting, with tired footsteps and bruised shoulders, and the strange, echoing weight of everything being too real and not real enough at the same time. After Orlleon, Jeanne did not rest. She might have, perhaps should have, might have returned to Domremy, to the quiet garden paths where she first heard her voices, to the soft hush of the chapel pews where her knees had shaped the wood. But her purpose had not yet reached its end. The voices had not told her to win a single battle. They had told her to see Charles crowned, not in hiding, not in the shadows of doubt, but in Reims, the ancient place of coronations, the city where French kings had been anointed for centuries. And so she turned toward it, toward Reims. The city lay far to the northeast, behind lines of uncertain loyalty, through roads thick with mud and rumors. It was not a simple ride. It was not a parade. It was a test of belief, stretched over miles of countryside still raw from war, where villages watched from windows and held their breath when her banner passed, not sure if what they saw was salvation or madness. Even now, people weren't certain. How could they be? But Jean walked, and then rode, with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. Her armor, though scratched and dulled, still fit. Her banner, though weathered, still flew. She prayed as she traveled, spoke little, ate what was given, slept only when the horses did. Her focus was not on spectacle but on arrival, because she understood something most had forgotten, that the power of a king did not come only from sword or treaty or coin. It came from being seen, truly seen, by the people, beneath God, in the place that crowned the soul as much as the body. Charles, for his part, had begun to change. He had always been cautious, gentle, perhaps too gentle, hesitant in a world that rewarded boldness. But beside Jean, he began to stand straighter. He watched how the people responded to her, how doors opened, how soldiers followed, how the winds themselves seemed to shift when she entered a village square. And he allowed himself at last to believe that maybe he was meant for more than mere survival. So they went together. Through Troy, where the town initially resisted, only to surrender within days when they saw Jean praying on the ramparts. Through Chalons, where mothers placed herbs at her feet and children tried to touch the hem of her tunic. Through Reims itself, which did not fall by force but opened its gates in stillness, as though history itself had taken a long breath and exhaled. The coronation was set. It took place on July 17, 1429. The cathedral stood tall, its stained glass windows catching the light of a summer morning, its bells ringing low and wide through the stone streets. Inside, the ceremony unfolded with all the solemnity that centuries had built. Latin chants, holy oil, the relics of saints brought from hidden places, and the crown held carefully in trembling hands. Jean did not stand at the center. She did not wear jewels. She did not seek the throne. She stood off to the side, her banner in her hands, eyes raised not to the crown but to the altar. Because for her, this moment was not about Charles alone, but about fulfillment. The voices had brought her here, and now it was happening. Charles knelt. The archbishop anointed him with oil, the same oil that had touched the foreheads of his ancestors, the same oil thought to carry not just ritual but inheritance. The crown was placed on his head. The lords bowed. The people cheered. And Jean, in her armor with dust on her boots and light in her eyes, knelt too. She wept, not loudly, not for herself, but because she had done what she was sent to do, because the thing she had believed in when no one else did had come to pass, because the boy from Chinon, hidden in plain clothes in a crowded room, was now King Charles VII, not because of her, but because of the path she had helped him walk. Afterward, when asked what she felt in that moment, she did not speak of pride. She said only that her banner had been closer to the altar than even the king. And that, she said, was right, because it had borne the truth. And the truth had led them all. That night, the city glowed with celebration. Torches, bells, bread shared in the streets, laughter where once there had been silence. And Jean once again did not seek the center of it. She withdrew to a chapel, she prayed. She sat alone for a while, her hands resting in her lap, listening. Because the voices had grown quiet again. Not absent, but still. As if they too were watching. And though many thought the story had reached its end, she knew otherwise. The crown was only part of the promise. The peace had not yet come. But for now, on that one day in July, in a cathedral filled with light and dust and history, Jean, daughter of farmers, hearer of saints, rider of storms, had fulfilled the things she was born to carry. And the bells of Reims rang not just for a king, but for a girl who believed. Chapter 8. Captured. There's a kind of silence that follows triumph, not peace exactly, but a lull. A stretch of time where the light begins to fade differently, where faces turn away just a little quicker, and where the warmth of applause is replaced by something colder, something less certain. After the coronation at Reims, Jean might have expected rest, but the voices, when they returned, did not speak of stillness. They urged her on. The work, they said, was not finished. And Jean believed them. France, after all, was still broken in places. The English still held land. The Burgundians, those uneasy allies who had betrayed their king, still plotted. Charles, though crowned, had not yet taken Paris. And so Jean, ever obedient, turned once more toward movement. She gathered what forces she could. She prayed. She planned. She kept her armor laced and her banner close, still believing that God's task was not yet complete. But something had shifted. It was subtle at first. A delay here, a dismissal there. Charles no longer listened quite as quickly. His advisors, polite but increasingly reserved, began to sideline her voice in councils. They thanked her, but with the tone one uses for a guest whose visit has gone on too long. She had been the spark they needed. But now that the fire was lit, they no longer wished to be warmed by its unpredictability. Still, Jean pressed on. The campaign turned toward Paris, the heart of France, still held by enemies. She led troops toward the capital, praying each morning, sleeping in her armor by night, riding with the same banner she had carried through Orlleon. But the resistance was strong. The plans, rushed, unrefined, began to falter. She was wounded again. The city did not fall. And then came Compiègne. It was May. The countryside was green and blooming, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and young leaves. Jean had ridden there to defend the town against a Burgundian siege, a surprise assault that came swiftly and tightened like a noose. The gates opened. She rode out with her men. They skirmished, they tried to push the enemy back. But then, as if the wind itself turned, the gates behind her closed. Why they closed remains debated. Some say panic, others treachery, still others mere confusion. But the result was the same. Jean was outside, alone, surrounded. She fought, not recklessly, but with the strength of someone who had not yet finished what she came to do. Her sword moved with purpose. Her banner still rose above the field. But there were too many. She was pulled from her horse, not thrown, not beaten, but caught, held, detained by soldiers who saw not a girl, but a symbol they had been told to fear. She did not cry out, she did not plead. She stood, even as they bound her wrists. She looked them in the eyes, and then she was led away. From that moment, Jean was no longer a commander, no longer a saint in motion. She became something else, a prisoner, not of the people, but of politics. The Burgundians who held her now knew her value. They did not see a soldier. They saw a bargaining chip. She was held in a castle, not a dungeon, but not comfort either. A cell of stone, cold, damp, dim. Her armor was removed, her banner taken. Her freedom, that quiet, private strength that had carried her across France, now reduced to footsteps within the same small room. And yet, Jean did not despair. She prayed. She fasted. She spoke kindly to her guards, even as they mocked her. She wrote letters when allowed, and when not, she dictated them to those who would carry her words. She did not curse, she did not beg. The English, furious at what she had cost them, demanded her hand. The Burgundians agreed, for a price, 30,000 livres tournois, a sum not paid in coin alone but in the currency of fear. The king she had crowned, Charles, did not come for her, did not send riders, did not negotiate. He remained silent. And in that silence, Jean remained whole. She had no army now, no advisors, no lords to speak her name in court. She had only her memory, her voices, her purpose. Still intact, still alive, even as the walls closed in. When asked how she bore it, the isolation, the betrayal, the long waiting, she said only that her saints still came. Less often, more quietly. But they came, and when they did, they told her not to fear. There was a calmness in her, even then. A softness that could not be undone. They had taken her sword, her horse, her mission, but they had not taken her stillness. That she carried with her into the next room, into the next night, and into the trial that would try to break it. Chapter 9. The Trial. The room where they questioned her was not made for kindness. It was tall and bare, with stone that held the cold even after sunlight touched it, and air that never quite stirred. The windows were narrow, high up near the ceiling, where the light fell in stripes, not warmth. At the center of the chamber was a long wooden table, polished not for beauty but for control, and behind it, always, sat men who already believed they knew the answers. She was 19, but they didn't call her Jean. They called her prisoner, accused, heretic. They asked her questions as if she were a puzzle to solve or a fire to snuff, never as a person. She wore no armor now, only a rough woolen tunic and simple shoes. Her hair had grown a little, her eyes tired, but she walked into the room each day with her back straight, her hands steady, her voice unwavering. They questioned her for months, not once, not twice, but day after day, hour after hour, until the rhythm of interrogation became like weather, pressing down, always there. The judges were scholars, clergy, men of rank and robes and Latin. Some were kind, others cruel, most were cold. They asked about her visions, about the voices, about the saints, where they came from, what they wore, what words they used, whether they smelled like heaven, whether she knelt, whether they touched her. Jean answered each question slowly, not because she didn't know, but because she knew that every word would be turned like a blade in their hands. Still, she told them the truth, her truth, in the same calm voice she'd used on battlefields and at coronations. She said the voices had come from God, that they had comforted her, that they had never lied. They didn't like that. They asked her about dressing as a man, about her armor, her banner, her sword. They asked if she thought she was sinless, if she thought she heard angels better than priests, if she believed herself the mouthpiece of heaven. Jean said only that she had been obedient, not proud, not holy, just willing. They didn't like that either, and so the questions turned sharper. They tried to confuse her, to trap her, to coax her into contradiction. They wrote her answers down, in ink and judgment, in pages that would become history. But Jean, who had never studied Latin, who had never read a single book, outthought them, not through wit, but through clarity. When they asked if she was in God's grace, a question designed to trick her, to make her blaspheme if she answered one way and lie if she answered the other, she paused, folded her hands, and said, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." There was nothing they could say to that. But still they tried. They moved her from room to room. They denied her mass. They told her the king had abandoned her, which was true, that she was forgotten, which was not, that the saints had lied, that her voices had deceived her, that her purpose was false, that she had been nothing more than a girl with strange dreams and the misfortune of believing them too much. She did not shout. She did not weep in front of them. She spoke, clearly, carefully, again and again. She told them she had worn men's clothing for safety, that she had cut her hair to protect herself, that she had ridden to Orlleon because God had asked her to, that she had seen things no one else could see, not with the eyes, but with the part of herself that had always listened when the world grew quiet. And still the verdict loomed. They had not brought her here to be proven right. They had brought her here to be broken. And when argument failed, they turned to fear. They threatened her with torture, brought her to the chamber, showed her the instruments, the wheel, the iron, the ropes, the long, empty dark. She trembled, yes, but she did not beg. She said only that, even if they tore her apart, she would still say what she had seen, because she had seen it. And God knew the truth, even if no one else in the room would admit it. At one point, they offered her mercy, or the appearance of it. They placed parchment before her and told her to sign. A confession, a retraction, a way to live. And after long hours, without counsel, without sleep, in fear and weakness and deep human exhaustion, she did. She signed. A mark. A name. A brief, flickering compromise. But afterward, when the voices returned, and she was left alone in her cell with the knowledge that the truth had been bent to survive, something within her recentered. She repented the denial. She said she would rather die than lie again. She asked for a dress. They refused. She put on her soldier's tunic once more. The trial was resumed. This time there would be no delay, no parchment, no chance for escape. The sentence was passed. The pyre was built. And John, quiet and small and unshaking, stood exactly where she had always stood, in the middle of her purpose. Not triumphant, not tragic, but whole. Because even then, even when condemned, she knew what the others refused to know, that the fire could not reach what had already burned bright within her. Chapter 10. The Fire and the Sky. Morning came early in Rouen, though you wouldn't have known it from the light. The sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that doesn't move, a ceiling instead of a canvas. The air held a dampness that clung to fabric and hair, and the river, just beyond the city's edge, moved with its usual indifference. But inside the castle, past the guards in the corridors and the prayers that clung like breath to the stone walls, a girl was preparing to meet her last day. She woke early, or maybe she hadn't really slept. Sleep, after all, is a thing of softness, of letting go, and Jean had long since learned to live inside her wakefulness. The straw mattress beneath her had not changed. The walls had not widened, but something within her had stilled. Not in fear, but in readiness, as if the path she had walked for so long had simply narrowed now, funneled to a single point, and she had only to keep walking. One more morning, one more hour, until the path ended where it was always meant to. She asked for a cross. She wanted one to hold. Not for show, not to plead with, but for the comfort of it. For the closeness of something that had walked beside her since she was a child, tracing prayers into dust with her fingertips. They brought her one made of wood. Simple, she pressed it to her chest, kissed it, then asked if a priest might hold another, higher, so she could see the smoke. She dressed. the same way she always had, with grace, with calm, with the quiet dignity of someone whose thoughts were already elsewhere. She spoke kindly to those around her, thanked them, asked for confession, asked to receive the sacrament. And though some granted it, others did not. Politics, even now, curled its fingers into the cloth of mercy. But Jean, ever steady, folded her hands and closed her eyes. She prayed anyway. Outside, the square was gathering. People came not because they rejoiced, but because they needed to see. Some came out of duty, others curiosity. Some came holding shame quietly behind their eyes. Some wept already. Some held their children closer, whispering explanations they barely understood themselves. But most came in silence, their feet clicking on the stones, their shoulders hunched beneath the weight of what was about to be done. The platform had been built high, not for cruelty, they said, but visibility. It stood tall in the Place du Vieux Marché, framed by walls and watching windows, surrounded by the rhythm of the city, markets, carts, chimneys, rain. But all of that seemed paused now. Time itself had held its breath. Jean was led out. She did not resist. Her hands were bound, but her posture was unbowed. She did not scream, she did not plead. Her eyes, dark, open, and clear, did not search the crowd for rescue. She knew no one would come. Not her king, not the saints, not the wind, but she walked with peace. The wood had been stacked high, bundles of kindling, dry branches, thick logs layered like argument and accusation. The executioners stood by, silent. The clerics stood nearby, some praying, others not. And in the crowd, somewhere not too far, someone held a cross aloft. Small, brass, shining even in the gray. Jean saw it. She nodded, and then she was raised, bound to the post, arms to her sides, a rope at her waist. She was no longer a soldier now, no longer a messenger, no longer the girl who had ridden through the gates of Orlleon with a banner as white as the sky above the city. She was something else entirely. Something quiet, something eternal. The flames were lit. Not all at once. Fire moved slowly at first, like breath, like thought, licking the edges of the wood, winding into corners, rising with the careful hunger of something that knows it has time. The smoke curled first, soft and gray, before turning dark, turning deep, turning hot. But Jean did not thrash, she did not cry out for pardon. She called only one name, over and over, a single name, Jesus. Not shouted, not screamed, spoken, like prayer. They say her voice rose above the crowd. They say the wind quieted. They say the birds did not sing. They say that even the men who had condemned her, who had scribbled the charges and weighed the chains and spoken the sentence, wept before it was over. And when it ended, when the flames had turned wood to ash and ash to silence, there was a stillness that no one could speak into. A hush, not of reverence, but of recognition. That something had happened here which could not be undone. They scattered her ashes in the Seine. They did not want a grave, did not want a shrine, did not want memory to root. But memory is not so easily washed away. Not when it rides on the breath of those who saw. Not when it clings to letters, to dreams, to prayers whispered behind shut doors. Not when it lives in the quiet gaze of a girl who listened and never stopped. And though the fire took her body and the world turned its page, the story did not end. Because some truths survive burning. And some names once carried in silence echo softly across centuries, like banners lifted even now.